Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant doctor and I'm based in private practice in Harley Street, London. I'm delighted to be joined today by Max Cohen. Max is a therapist I've known for a long time, and Max Cohen has a lot of very interesting views on therapy. So Max, let me start by asking you a little bit about yourself, your training, your background and your practice.
Of course. Good morning. Thank you for asking me to do this, Raj. So I received some help myself in my late 20s, had some issues and went to see a counsellor and really enjoyed the process. Prior to that, I'd worked as a designer, interior designer, furniture designer for many years. And that work was drying up. I became very interested in the whole process of counselling. Feeling heard, feeling supported, feeling accepted, feeling that I wasn't being judged. And I was doing group therapy, and the therapist said to me at the end of the period of group, he said, "You might be really good at this one day, but give it 5 years." And I thought that was very interesting, because I feel that nowadays we maybe rush people into counselling as therapists, and they maybe haven't always resolved the issues that they present with in the first. So I had those 5 years. So I just enrolled. I was living in North London. I enrolled at City University evening class, one evening a week for a couple of terms, to do humanistic and person-centered counselling course. I didn't know anything about counselling. I didn't know there were different types and different models of counselling. So that was the spark. That's how it started.
So let's pick up on that point. I think you're right. Most people don't realize how vastly different the different schools of psychotherapy are. And at the last count, someone tried to count them all. There were 450 different formal schools of psychotherapy, which is a very big number.
Yeah.
So you mentioned person-centered and humanistic. Now, the way that I understand what that means, and you must correct me if I'm wrong and tell me a little bit more, is that person-centered therapy isn't trying to be interventionistic. It's not trying to issue instructions to the patient. It's not trying to analyze the patient, and it's not trying to make assertive statements like they do in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is that the reason why you feel low is because you're having negative thoughts. It's much more that the patient drives the therapy. But you tell me if you agree with that categorization.
Absolutely. After that person-centered humanistic training, I went on to did a psychodynamic. In fact, I'd done 2 different psychodynamic trainings, and that really appealed to me more. But the person-centered stuff is really based around the work of Carl Rogers. And I'm not going to be able to remember all the principles, but it's about being genuine with your client, being authentic, being non-judgmental, and really developing empathy. And he talked about empathy being a gift that some people have it, some don't. You can't really learn it, but you can certainly develop what one already has.
Genuine empathy, genuineness, empathy, and warmth. GE and W were the key catchphrases in the 70s and 80s. It was about the idea that the kind of therapist you are is more important than the kind of therapy you practice. Could you say a bit about that, if you agree with that?
Absolutely. He talked about unconditional positive regard, which I still struggle with, 30 years later, whatever it is. But yeah, it was very much about self-development of the therapist, as much as really supporting the client.
Now, you've had several different kinds of trainings and you've been in a group yourself. Now, one of the things I bang on about in this series is about the how to help clients choose a therapist. And I think that you've betrayed one of the reasons why I think you're a good therapist. I mean, I know that anyway, but I mean, for a client who doesn't know anything about therapy, the fact you've tried to get more than one different kind of training to me is an excellent sign. And I would be worried about someone who's just had one form of training. What are your thoughts about that?
Absolutely. I think things have changed a lot since I began in this field, where you really did have to choose one model of training. And as I did my psychodynamic training, the British Association of Counsellors, as it was then, now it's called British Association of Counsellors and Psychotherapists, wanted the course to integrate other models of therapy, and that turned into what we now call integrative therapy, which takes elements of many different models of therapy. So I was doing primarily psychodynamic, which came really from the work of Freud and Jung. It acknowledged the existence of the unconscious. It looked at how relationships might be formed on transferring qualities and beliefs from previous relationships into current relationships. It looked at the world of kind of fantasy and dream, projection, and all kinds of really interesting influences there. But in order to qualify, we had to integrate other models. So some of those other models, again, went back to the humanistic stuff. Existential, which I studied for years and I never really got it. I still don't fully understand that model. But, the beginnings of cognitive behavioral therapy were creeping in. And that took two very different paths: cognitive stuff, i.e. the mind and the brain, and what am I thinking, what am I saying to myself? And then behavioral therapy, looking at behavior and uniting those. Since then, I've found myself doing a lot of trauma work, and I qualified in EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is a mouthful, and the person that invented it regretted calling it that. But it's a very specific treatment for trauma in the NICE guidelines. More recently, I've been looking at more body-based work, thinking about that trauma is really held in the body, in the tissues and muscles. And I've been doing something called EFT, which is really acupressure tapping. So literally tapping on acupressure points whilst focusing on various memories. A very long answer to a short question.
So tell us a little bit about the kind of patients you see. One of the things I know you specialize in, and I know you have different interests, is people with addiction problems. So tell us a bit about that. And it's a very thorny issue, isn't it? There's a very low success rate, in my opinion, with alcoholism, drug addiction, with most conventional approaches. And even if you spend a lot of money and go to some of the big brand name hospitals, I won't say what they are, but they're very expensive, £5,000, £7,000 a week at least, they often don't work, surprisingly, because what happens is they provide four walls that keep you from the alcohol and the drugs, and then a month later you come out having spent a fortune and you go straight back to drinking or taking drugs again. And a lot of people, particularly the parents of addicts, don't realize this, and they hand over the money and they don't realize that this vast expense is probably, in many cases, money down the drain, in my opinion. So what are your thoughts about that?
It's such a big question. I think timing is key, because I think if you shove somebody into a treatment facility, and there are many other ways of recovering, is the word that's kind of generally used. Recovering from addiction doesn't have to be in a residential treatment center, but often I think if you push people or coerce them or force them, as the criminal justice system often does, too early, it can put them off treatment and put them off therapy for life. So I think, I go back to really, really early kind of thoughts about this. I used to work in an alcohol treatment facility, voluntary facility in Hackney. And we used to talk about ready, willing, and able, that somebody needed to be ready and willing and able. And you can be willing and able, but you're not ready yet. So we would use a model called motivational interviewing, which would try to kind of bring that person's rock bottom up to meet them, bring the crisis that was inevitably going to happen, bring it up to meet them and stuff. And sometimes that was successful and sometimes it wasn't. But I think the real answer, my personal belief, is that in the UK, we traditionally have treated addiction separately to other issues, health, physical health issues, but especially separately to other mental health issues. And a model that I quite like is to think of addiction as, I prefer the word dependency, where we become dependent on a substance or a behavior. It could be gambling, it could be screen addiction, it could be the internet, it could be sex, it could be food. It doesn't have to be substances. The same parts of the brain light up when we're in those so-called process addictions. That very often, I think that we're self-medicating unwanted or difficult feelings, beliefs. Very often there are massive feelings of low self-esteem and lack of confidence in individuals. There may well be ADHD, depression, anxiety, and what we're doing by using those drugs is trying to self-medicate. It's like we found a medicine that works for me, but it doesn't necessarily come from the doctor. It might come from the guy on the street corner.
It's a very problematic area, and it's got a very low success rate, generally speaking. Would you agree with that?
No, not necessarily. I think there are treatment approaches that can be very successful. But going back to what I said about being ready, willing, and able, if we can get all of those three on the same page, that's a lot to do with the individual. It's about hope. It's about belief that I could, this could work for me. I think it's also about talking about recovery from addiction is possible, because I think a lot of people don't know that. If you grow up in a family that has 3 or 4 generations of addictive drinking, we don't call it addiction or alcoholism. It's just everybody drinks heavily. You're going to be very influenced by that, genetically and environmentally.
So you said motivational interview is bringing the crisis up to the patient. My understanding of what you mean by that is that motivational interviewing tries to get the patient to see the future and see the future consequences. So they say things like, if you carry on drinking like this, given your boss has given you 3 warnings because you not turned up at work, what do you think is going to happen? And get them to live through the crisis of losing their job, etc., etc. So the reality is that often it is an actual crisis that makes people come to the table eventually when you talk about ready, willing, and able. Unfortunately, it seems to be an actual crisis a lot of the time. But motivational interview is trying to get them to experience the crisis, as I understand it, you correct me if I'm wrong, before it actually happens. Could you say something about that?
I'm not entirely sure, and I don't use motivational interviewing very much, but obviously was trained in it because in the 70s, that was really the model that was used to treat people with alcohol problems. And then what happened as people started presenting with addiction to substances, mainly it was opiates and heroin through the 70s and 80s, heroin flooded London. We used those old methods to treat alcoholism, tried to make it work with addicts using other substances. And that was successful to some degree. And of course, the 12-step fellowships, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and NA especially took off in London during the 80s. But the motivational interviewing really looks at stages of moving somebody towards making change in their lives. So it looks at, shall I run through them? Pre-contemplation. So I'm not really contemplating any changes I'm using, and I'm not looking at making any changes. Then I begin to get into trouble. I get caught, or it's not working anymore. I'm developing tolerance, so I need more drugs or more gambling to make me feel, soothe me, whatever. That stage might be called contemplation. So I'm beginning to contemplate change. Then maybe I begin to investigate what change is available. I might find that. Then I go into the kind of the action. I'm going to put this into action now. And then I go into maintenance. So now I've managed to stop using, I'm getting support, I need to maintain it. And then the other stage that a lot of people say should be included, but originally wasn't, is the stage of denial and relapse. And that the belief with that model is if you relapse, you can immediately get back on track and skip pre-contemplation and go straight back into action and maintenance, which is great. That's a nice way of thinking about things.
Yeah. Sorry, go on. You were going to...
Well, I was going to say something about denial, because the way you were suggesting it, Raj, is, trying to get people to contemplate, and I might say this to people sometimes in a therapy session, where do you see yourself in a year's time? Where do you see yourself in 5 years' time if you don't make any changes? And that's, obviously not going to go well for most people in active addiction. But we think about Freud's idea of denial, which is that unwanted material kind of gets repressed and pushed down into the unconscious. The addiction field have taken that concept and kind of changed it into denial being, I'm an addict and I believe that I can stop whenever I want. I believe I'm in control of this. And the evidence to the outside world is you can't control this. You're out of control. You're not managing. This is getting worse and worse and worse. But the addict can't see that. So what a lot of addiction treatment is about really is trying to help people work through the denial by seeing the reality.
Now, what are your thoughts about this? In my opinion, very often the parents have the money, the addict has burned through their money, and parents or relatives are the ones funding treatment. And because the addict's behavior, if they're drinking too much or taking drugs, alarms the parents or alarms the person who might be funding treatment, they tend to they're treating their own anxiety, as it were, by pursuing treatment when the addict isn't ready. And so a lot of the time I spend telling parents, you need to leave the addict alone, and they will have to, when they're ready, we will know that because they'll come begging for treatment. At the moment, you're the one begging for treatment. Can you not see that you're very motivated? But the very fact you're the one contacted me, you're the one set up the appointment, and where the addict at the center is kind of having treatment thrown at them, but they're not initiating. And therefore, my advice is don't do anything, right? Let's wait and see. Now, what are your thoughts about that? I mean, it's a high risk thing because bad things can happen. And parents find this very difficult. It raises their anxiety. But I actually think sometimes the most therapeutic intervention is to tell people the addict isn't ready, stop battling with them and dragging them to therapy, leave them alone. It seems paradoxical, but leave them alone. I mean, in medicine, in general practice, there's this famous thing called wait and see, which is you've got to teach medical students to wait and see because they like to leap in and do a lot of things rather than wait and see. So this is almost a kind of version of wait and see. So what are your thoughts about that? I actually think it takes a really confident therapist or psychiatrist to say, don't do anything. But what are your thoughts about that?
Well, the phrase I guess we've been using for years is tough love, which is, so I'm actually, I think, far better at working with the families of addicts than I am with addicts seeking treatment. I love working with addicts who are a few years abstinent and getting on with their lives, and everything that happens to everyone else is happening. So relationship problems, identity, work, blah, blah, blah. But working with families, I try to help families see that the addict doesn't have to be the center of attention. The whole world revolves around somebody's addiction. Either people are dancing around it and avoiding it, or people are doing what you're saying, Raj, jumping in and trying to help and stuff. And I think it's important to try all of that stuff. And if it works and that person is ready to accept help and support, that's brilliant. But what I always say to the family members, mother, father, sister, brother, boss, daughter, child, whatever, is get help for yourself. It's like that thing about, put your life jacket on first before you can help somebody else in an airplane or your oxygen mask, sorry. So they often feel they don't have the skills to help. They don't know what to do or where to go or who to ask. There's a massive amount of shame involved in addictions. So parents don't want to ask for help because they don't want anyone to know that their child, is an addict. They won't go and talk to their GP, possibly even, or sister or brother or people that might support. So they become very isolated in the same way that the addict is becoming isolated, because they also have shame plus guilt about what's going on. But the denial is so great they don't feel it. So whole families can go into denial, not just the person using drugs or alcohol. So my focus is always on the family. You need to get help. And there are some specialist support groups, free ones like Families Anonymous, Codependence Anonymous, Emotions Anonymous, that can help people that don't have addictions but are, dealing with somebody else's addiction, to get the focus on them and ask themselves, well, what do you need? But I absolutely agree with you, Raj, that it's so difficult because everybody wants to try and help the person who we think is suffering, struggling, and they may not be, and they may not be ready yet.
Well, this is a very deep point. I actually think we're discussing one of the key interventions that helps addicts is stopping the family constantly intervening. So tell the family, do nothing, and the addict is then left to confront problems that they're, to some extent, there's a safety net's been built or protected from. So that's the key intervention. Now, the trouble is you enter medical legal problems. You tell the parents, don't do anything. Then the addict rings up and says, I need, this has happened to me, £10,000, otherwise drug dealer gangsters will come over and break my legs. Okay. And you say to the parents, don't give them the £10,000. Because what you're doing is you're rewarding the telling of stories in order to get money, and the money will end up being shot up their arm or whatever. And the parents find this very difficult. And I've been there where there's an hourly countdown to the Russian gangsters or whatever turning up, and the parents will keep calling me and saying, look, I'm really worried. And then the deadline will come and pass, and of course no gangsters have turned up, but it was a gangsters could have turned up. I didn't know whether they were going to turn up or not. I just know that keep throwing money at the problem, like in demand, which is what's happening with addicts, is not working. Now, when you tell the family, don't give them any money, and the person is in extremis in trouble, if anything was to happen to that patient, when you gave the advice, even though you may document everything, and there's a let's say, God forbid, there's a coroner's inquiry, you could get into trouble. So I think it takes a very brave therapist, and very few therapists are actually willing to do that thing and actually give the correct advice, which is don't do anything. Some therapists will say, my advice is don't do anything. But then if the parents go, look, I really think we should do something, the therapist will go, it's up to you, right? They'll back away a little bit from insisting. Was I think the correct, and I'm interested in your opinion here, the correct thing is to say, listen, it is up to you. It's your money. You can decide how you want to spend it. But my advice to you is quite clearly that continuing to throw money at this problem when they keep begging for money or keep giving them a bed for the night is actually feeding the addiction. You're enabling the addiction, and you've got to stop doing it. So, because I believe that just being kind of non-interventionistic doesn't help these parents. You really have to express great confidence and great assertiveness that the correct thing to do is to leave the addict alone. But what are your thoughts about that?
I have two thoughts about that. I was trained as a therapist to never give advice, which, but of course one wants to guide and support. So you use the word enabling. So what I would want to do is I would want the family to get some help and support for themselves. I would want them to learn about, well, what is enabling? Why do families enable? And what it means is I'm giving you money to enable you to carry on, or I'm ringing up your boss to say, oh, you've got a cold when you're unconscious on the floor from last night. I'm enabling you to not face the consequences. So going back to the tough love thing is about families feeling empowered, and they need support to do this, to be able to look beyond, oh my God, my child's struggling or my husband's in trouble, I've got to help. To think about, well, what do I need to do to help myself? And is what I'm about to do really helpful, or does it just extend and continue the problem and stuff? So that's my advice to the parents is, let's look at this. And then to talk through all the various options. And, there's a whole kind of discipline called interventionists. So these are people, sometimes they're trained as therapists, sometimes not. Sometimes they're people that have resolved their own drug and alcohol issues who will stage something called an intervention. And usually you or somebody like me would be involved as well. And what you do is you go and speak to the individual members of the family, and you say, how has Joe Bloggs's addiction affected you? Oh, he lied to me, he stole my jewelry. Or I love him, but he just can't stop. And I'm really upset. I feel that I'm out of control. I'm struggling with depression. My husband wants to do one thing, I want to do another. It's causing problems in our relationship, because addiction is a very powerful thing. Nobody really knows what to do. what the interventionist does is gather that kind of material, and then they stage what they call an intervention, where they get all of those people together in the room with the addicts brought in, and then the interventionist might ask people, could you tell me what you said about blah-de-blah's addiction? How is it affecting you? So the addict kind of hears it. And the goal of the intervention is always that the interventionist is trying to get the individual with a problem to go and get some help.
How far would you go? Again, one of the things I do in my
Yeah.
practice, I often recommend that the parents don't take phone calls from the addict, because if you take a phone call, the addict will be trying to manipulation and telling a story or crying down the phone, and the parent will be vulnerable. And no matter how much you say the parents need support, once the addict gets to work on them in an untrammeled way, they're in trouble, in my opinion. So I'll often say, don't take emails, don't take phone calls. So you put up the drawbridge and you build a wall around you that the addict cannot penetrate. Now, do you believe that's extreme in terms of advice, or again, you keep saying you don't give advice, but in terms of an intervention, what do you think about that idea? Because I believe that that's what needs to happen.
Sure.
In my opinion.
So, well, when I say I don't give advice, I would, kind of suggest different options that people might do. I remember working with a guy many years ago at one of the residential addiction treatment centres in London, and he was a peer supporter. So he was a father whose son had gone through treatment, and the father had come back because we had a family group, a group that supported families there, and he was a peer supporter. So he supported other members. He could take phone calls from them in between the therapy sessions, the group sessions, etc. And I remember we were talking about boundaries. So a boundary is a statement that I might make. So if it was you, Raj, I would say, Raj, I feel really uncomfortable when you ring me up and keep asking me for money. And if you continue to do that, I'm going to hang up. I'm going to ask you how you are, but I'm going to hang up, and I'm going to think about what I want to do, or I'm not going to take the call, or whatever. So the boundary is me deciding what's okay with me and what isn't okay with me. And what this man said was that if his son turned up at their house stoned, asking for money and kind of terrifying him and his wife, rather than saying, I'm never going to let you in the house again, because he knew he couldn't be able to follow through with that, or saying, I'm never going to speak to you again, he knew he couldn't do that. What he said to his son is, we won't let you in, but I will think about what the consequences are going to be, and I will let you know. And I thought it was the most brilliant boundary, because it gave him a bit of breathing space. It gave him permission to think about, well, what can I do and what can't I do? But it was a very clear message to the son that his behavior was not acceptable.
Yes, you've sidestepped a little bit, which is perfectly understandable and reasonable. The point I was trying to suggest, which is the advice of drawing up the drawbridge, because in that case, the guy isn't really drawing up the drawbridge. There's still a drawbridge that's down a little bit. And I'm arguing. Now, I think that the other issue here, and I'm interested in your opinion on this, what I tend to do is say that let the addict call me. Okay. And I will let you know, I will let the parents know if I really think it's a real crisis. So I act as a buffer between the addict and the parent, and allow the parent then to draw up the drawbridge. Because if they're drawing up the drawbridge and leave the addicts out there alone on the streets with no support, then they find that difficult. If I say, well, they've got my number, they can call me, I can arrange an appointment. So it's not like they've got nothing. So I exist as a buffer between the addict and the parents, or whatever. But anyway, what do you think about that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. What I meant before about encouraging the family to get help is that they need to do the research and find out, well, what help is available, not just for me, but for my son. So, is Raj a specialist addictionologist? Does he work with this type of patient? Yes. Okay, so we could use him. Are there any free services nearby? I'm going to ring up, the Citizens Advice Bureau or talk to my GP. So you equip yourself with all of this stuff so that you can then, of course, present that. But the thing is that we're all different, and some people are able to do that tough love rejection. I'm not going to help you. You're on your own. Or if you can show me that you're really motivated to do this, then we'll have a conversation about possibly paying for you to go to treatment, and then we need to find the right one, etc. So I think there are options.
Yes. But what we're also saying, I think, and this is a very important point, we're shifting the focus to being the individual. Most people think about an individual going for therapy, like an addict going for therapy, as the key action is between the therapist and that particular patient. We're shifting the key territory to being the network of relationships between the addict and the people around the addict, who are often supporting, unwittingly supporting the addiction by just doing normal things that people do.
Yeah.
But they don't realize that these normal things that normal people do are actually poison when you're dealing with an addict, and they need to be educated about that. But we're shifting the key focus to this network of relationships and trying, I think I'm more interventionistic, I believe, than you are, but that's fine. Trying to intervene in these relationships and trying to strongly suggest to the people around to back away. We're trying to alter those relationships, and in creating a vacuum around the addict, right? I think the addict is now going to be forced to face the consequences of their actions, and that is the key therapeutic intervention.
Absolutely. That's about that person hitting their rock bottom or their crisis. So I remember working in a treatment many years ago, and we had one guy in there that was probably not going to live very long if he continued using, and organs were beginning to pack up, and he earned lots of money, and the family had thrown him out, and he was utterly desperate. And at some point he managed to get himself into a treatment facility. That was his rock bottom. It was horrible. He was in a group setting with a man who was a judge who had been caught drink driving, and that was his rock bottom. The shame that he would experience within his community of that coming out was enough to bring him into treatment, for him to recognize that he had an addiction problem. So everyone's rock bottom is different. That's what I'm trying to...
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about addictions again in a moment. But I want to say you also are interested in military personnel. You have an interest in that, in the military, as it were. Tell us a bit about that, because I find that very interesting.
Yeah. I sort of fell into this work through doing addiction treatment. When I first trained, I didn't work particularly with addicts. And then after a couple of years, somebody said to me, look, if you want to make a name for yourself and have a career in therapy, you really need to specialize. And I was very, very interested in addictions. But as I was saying before, I've always believed that the addictions are underpinned, but I say, I don't know, 90% of cases, that underneath the addiction is what we call ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So neglect or trauma, or, didn't get into that school I wanted to, feel inferior kind of stuff. Could be more serious than that. There may be some attention deficit issues. There may be anxiety, depression, trauma. If I grew up in a home where there was a lot of drinking or drug use, the environment will influence. So those underlying issues are the things that I always felt that we needed to treat. And I think one of the reasons for the high failure rate that you pointed out earlier is that we tend to isolate addiction from other mental health disorders and treat them separately. So you're depressed when you're a kid and you drink, and it relieves the depression. It gives you confidence to go and talk to people and blah, 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 and then it develops. You end up in a treatment center. They help you to stop drinking, but as soon as you leave, you feel depressed. And as soon as you feel depressed, your brain says, oh, a drink will change how I feel. So you relapse. So we've got to have a more holistic approach to treating what we call co-occurring disorders. And that means we need the skills to kind of understand this. So that leads me into, I got asked a few years ago to do some work for a charity called Veterans Aid in London. It's a homeless charity. They literally go out on the streets of London and they'll talk to homeless people, any of those homeless people that have ever been in the armed forces, even if they're only in for a day. Veterans Aid will support them. They'll try and find them housing. They've got a hostel in the East End. And then for a few of them, they'll also support them by sending them to therapy or counseling, help them do training, put them in college. Fantastic charity. So I began working with them, doing some addiction work with some of their guys. These were the homeless guys. And then over the last 10 or 12 years, we've developed that model. So sometimes now we're still serving personnel, some of them very senior officers, some not, that are willing to come forward and say, I've got some issues. But it's no longer just addiction work. So everybody thinks that these military charities, their whole focus is trauma, combat trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder. I don't think it's a disorder, by the way, but we'll talk about that another time. I think it's a completely normal response to something terrible that's happened to me or that I've seen. So I prefer post-traumatic stress response. Anyway, going on a sidetrack. So these guys came along and I fully expected that I'd be doing, lots of work with trauma, combat trauma, etc. But actually what these guys present with is the same as everybody else that might present in one's practice. All of the same issues. A lot of the guys that ended up homeless had terrible childhoods, like with an alcoholic parent or father that wasn't around or mother that hit them, and didn't do well at school, and then they join the armed forces and they get a sense of family. Suddenly they're a part of something, they have a role, they're told what to do, they're guided, and they feel very supported, even loved, although not many of my guys would probably use that word. But then what happens when they finish their military career and get kicked out, very few of the ones that end up homeless certainly have the skills to survive in society, don't know how to live, can't look after themselves. So a lot of that work that I do with those guys is, it's quite expansive. But there's a lot of addiction work and there's a lot of trauma work as well.
So you're right that most people think about it as post-traumatic stress disorder. I was very interested in your comment that you don't regard it as a disorder. You call it a post-traumatic stress response. And I think you've captured something that I've been thinking for a long time, because I don't like the word disorder with most things. I think most things like anxiety, for example, I prefer to just call it anxiety rather than anxiety disorder.
Yeah.
But I like I'm going to steal this thing now. I'm going to call it an anxiety response. I think quite often trying to normalize what people are experiencing as opposed to labeling it as a disorder is more helpful, I think. But what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think, the post-traumatic stress disorder is a medical diagnosis, and I'm not a medic, so I don't have to be restricted by those models. But I just think that it's a much kinder way of presenting it to somebody, because if you tell me I've got a disorder, I think, oh my God, that's terrible, I'm going to have this forever. I'm just stuck with this. If we talk about it differently and that recovery is possible, and clearly it is, we can help turn the volume down on somebody's response to when those trauma things trigger them, stuff. So I just think it's a kinder and more realistic approach. So, I mean, I could tell you, because I do some work with one of the big treatment centers in the States, and they've developed a program there for what they call first responders and military. So these are people like ambulance drivers, firemen that are dealing with life-threatening traumas every single day of their life, or ex-military guys, the same group that I work with in the UK, and they've developed a very specific program.
Actually, now you've mentioned first responders, I want to just talk a little bit about that.
Okay.
And we don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but I think that there's very much in the news at the moment are these school shootings, and very much in the news at the moment in the USA. It's a phenomenon. Nowhere else in the world has the same phenomenon, really. That's partly to do with the gun culture in the US. And bang in the center of the news at the moment is the first response to the most recent event. The police and the emergency staff have received a lot of criticism about the way they handle that. And I think there is a lot of stress around being the first responder. And actually, there has been a little bit of research done on this. And a lot of people don't realize how stressful that is, and how it's easy with the benefit of hindsight, when the event has played itself out tragically very often, to think, well, these people did the wrong thing. But first responders are often dealing with a very ambiguous situation where they're not sure what exactly is going on, and they're trying to make decisions under a very high stress experience. So tell me a bit about that. What are your thoughts are about that?
I'm going to start by saying something which might sound very weird, but for my own self-care, I don't read these stories. I'm aware that it's happened, but I find it very disturbing. And I deal with enough stuff in my everyday life. So to look after myself, I really self-limit the amount of news that I watch or listen to. I watch Have I Got News for You? And it tells me everything I need to know at the end of the week. And I do buy a newspaper and read it. So I'm not a complete Philistine. But, I was reading actually in the paper yesterday, 63% of Americans, in a recent poll are against these high velocity assault weapons. They shouldn't be out there. People should be screened and stuff. But unfortunately, the way the voting works in America, it's the kind of middle stuff, redneck kind of states like Texas that vote overwhelmingly have a lot more power. So I don't think it's going to go away. I think that what happens is if, as a first responder, if you're dealing with this stuff every day, you kind of get desensitized to it. But you're quite possibly going to be self-medicating yourself with over-the-counter medication you can go and buy in the chemist, or you're going to your doctor and he's prescribing Xanax or benzos or Diapran or Z drugs to help you sleep, and you may well be drinking. And there may well be a drinking culture within, your kind of workplace after work to kind of, de-stress and stuff. And then you go home and you have to be a husband or a wife or a parent and look after kids and stuff. It's enormous pressure. And I think these people need a lot of support. But there's a whole culture, isn't there, of people doing those kind of jobs, of not coming forward to ask for help. Because there's...
Yeah, sorry. But the other thing is what kind of person, a bit like the thing about the military, what kind of person is drawn to that job? I think there's a certain personality type that's drawn to it, where they find the crisis kind of appealing at some level.
Yeah.
And some of those people can act very confidently in a crisis, and you would want them on your side, definitely. But absolutely. I don't think enough thought is given to the idea there's a huge amount of psychology involved in that process, and it's not something you can simply train into people how to handle an incident like this.
Sure. Well, I know, for example, with special forces guys, they are screened and screened and screened very, very, very carefully. So they're looking at every aspect very holistically, and they use very sophisticated techniques to look at the psychology, look at the personality, the characteristics of that person, what can they bring. And my experience of working with some people has been that they're approaching it from a really caring, we want to try and change things perspective, obviously. The higher up you go is obviously much more sophisticated and stuff. But
yeah. But I want to come at this from a very unusual angle. I'd be interested in your opinion on this. I think that the military personnel stuff and the first responder stuff taps into another issue, which is about the notion of masculinity in modern society. So 50 years ago, 100 years ago, what it was to be male was to be a strong person. Physical strength wasn't necessary, and women depended on you doing physical strong things. And also you were the main breadwinner because you were economically active more than women were. Now that that's all changed, and most of the time in modern life, physical strength is not required, and also women can earn just as much money as men, etc., etc. What it is to be male becomes a real conundrum, and I think that the people drawn to the military have a kind of thing going on there, because there's a sense in which definitely to be a soldier and guns and so on is a very masculine thing. And my experience of these personnel people, often the very successful ones, is what they struggle in civilian life is how you translate that notion of masculinity into ordinary civilian life. They often become extreme versions of masculinity in the pursuit of sex or entertaining women, etc., etc. So I do think there's a kind of like man's man thing going on with them. And they're struggling a little bit about what it is to be male in the modern world, which is a much more feminine place than it may have been 25 or 30 years ago. So if I can divulge a little bit about myself, which we're not necessarily meant to, but anyway, I think that one of the reasons I'm so competitive on a tennis court, I play a lot of tennis, and I'm famous or infamous for naked ambition in terms of wanting to win, is I think that's my version of masculinity, as it were. And it's a very muted version in a sense, but there's a sense in which I express what it is to be male with that competitiveness on a tennis court. And I do think there's an issue about how men express being masculine. because I think actually, although it's an unfashionable thing to say, it's still an important thing to be able to be masculine. But what are your thoughts about that?
Absolutely. And we're all individuals, and we're all going to have different drives, and in some ways I'm not very competitive. In other ways I am, very competitive. I was given a Lifetime Achievement Therapy Award a few years ago, and I am so proud of that. And I don't want anyone else to ever be given it. I want to be the only one. So I kind of, no, I'm not competitive, but I am. And that's not necessarily a macho thing. That's about self-esteem and feeling insecure about myself, needing that badge. And I'm very proud of it. But yeah, of course, there are going to be individuals that need to be fiercely competitive and prove themselves in that way. And thank God, because they're driven and they're going to achieve things and get things done. If you can channel it, if it's not, self-destructive. Think about addiction. That's an incredibly single-minded drive. It takes a lot of creativity to maintain an addiction, whatever it is, over many years. So I think that it's a real mix. And, with my military guys, I think the point I'm trying to make is they are just as a varied section of society as the rest of society.
But do you not think that one of the things that makes them a bit lost when they leave the army? I mean, except there's a famous term that I think Goffman, a famous sociologist from the 60s, used, which is called a total institution, like monasteries and hospitals and so on,
Yeah.
total institutions, because they look after you entirely. Every need is looked after. They feed you, they give you a bed for the night, etc., etc.
Yep.
So I think they're often struggling a little bit with masculinity outside of the army as well. But let's talk about something else. Now, you're a representative, or you have a connection with a very famous treatment center in America called Sierra Tucson. Tell us a bit about that.
Okay, thank you. So I'm in private practice. I work in London and mostly working online now. And I've been working as a psychotherapist for years and years and years. And about 15 years ago, I had a very complex client, a young woman who was struggling with her work role. She was very, very successful, traveling all over the world, but burnt out and exhausted. Couldn't find any purpose in life in her work. She was married. The relationship wasn't great. She had some chronic pain from an old running injury that she was self-medicating by over-the-counter painkillers and seeing a couple of different doctors, I think. I'm not sure about that. Getting more painkillers, using a bit of alcohol. And there was some sexual abuse. She'd been abused by a teacher when she was a young kid. And I found, we referred her to Sierra Tucson. I'd met them, they'd come to London. I was very impressed with the model that they were describing. And they said, we're really good at working with complex clients where their needs are varied and many. And what we do is we work out a treatment plan, an individual plan for every single individual patient, where we would look at what do we need to treat first so that it doesn't trigger a lapse in this area, and how do we structure this person's treatment. And while she was still out in the States, I was invited to go and visit and have a look at Sierra Tucson. And I was just blown away. The change in her was quite miraculous. And I was very impressed. I met a lot of the staff, and the model that they use is something that I'd never really seen in the UK or Europe. It was a fully integrated for a few hours to pop in. Full-time psychiatrist, team of psychologists, psychotherapists. They would look at diet and nutrition. They would look at exercise. They have a GP that does physical, does all your kind of vitals. So they were really treating people holistically. Also, in addition to that, they were integrating 20, maybe even 30. In England, we might call them complementary therapies. In the States, they would call them integrated therapies. Things like EMDR, equine assisted therapy with horses, 10 different types of massage, from zero balancing to shiatsu to sweet, they were using acupuncture, homeopathy, acupressure, as I said, diet and nutrition. So they're working really in a very, very holistic way. And if you and I both arrived on the same day suffering from anxiety, we would still do a lot of work together, but we'd also have separate treatment plans that would be reviewed on a daily and then weekly basis and changed if necessary. So she was my kind of model. I saw her go through this treatment facility and I just thought, this is brilliant. I want to work with these guys, and have been ever since.
So could you, sorry,
yeah.
go on.
Well, I was just going to say, so that what Sierra Tucson treat is that they've always looked at, I suppose they're best known for treating addiction. We've had several high-profile people go there. And they've always called the addiction program addiction and co-occurring disorders. So they're immediately acknowledging that there's probably something else going on as well that needs looking at alongside the addiction. They have a mood program which treats, in its most basic form, anxiety, depression, and bipolar disorder. They have a trauma program, of which the red, white, and blue, the one for the military and first responders, is a kind of an adjunct. It's joined on, but they have a primary trauma program. Very interestingly, they have what used to be called chronic pain program. Now it's called pain management program, especially in the opiate crisis that swept across the States. This program is very, very busy with the overprescription of opioids. And how do we help people with chronic pain use less opioids? And also what's going on underneath their chronic pain. Raj, I've just lost you. I don't know whether we're still running. Oh, okay. So you can still hear me, right? So we were talking about the various different programs at Sierra Tucson. We've recently, so there's a trauma program, there's a family program where anybody that's doing any of those programs, their families can come in and do 4 days of treatment with family therapists that are not working with the loved one who's the patient, only working with the family, asking them what's going on with them, what help and support do they have, what help and support might they need. And then they do some very carefully facilitated work, the beginning of conversations between you and your other, the child, husband, wife who's in treatment. We've recently developed a licensed professionals program, which are for people like us, Raj, doctors, therapists, that often don't recognize that we need help and support as well. There's a LGBTQIA program. There's a fantastic program, Maternal Mental Health, which looks at pre and postnatal mental health disorders and postpartum depression. And to cap it all off, something called 365, which is really interesting when you were talking before about the low numbers of people succeeding. So this is an app that everyone who goes through treatment has on their phone. And when they leave, they're allocated a coach, and that coach will check in with them daily at first. Then it goes down to weekly, and the coach is saying, how are you doing? Are you okay? Do you need any help and support? If you've signed up to go to NA meetings or AA, are you doing that? Are you taking a medication if you're a mood patient, etc.? And they have that for a year, and it can be extended if needed. And also the family have access to that 365 app for a year. So you get to speak to a live coach on the premises, on the staff at Sierra Tucson. Raj, it's really difficult because I can't hear you. So I'm thinking I should probably stop talking. And I don't know whether we can communicate on the chat. Okay. Okay, sorry, Raj, I missed that. So the cost is, it's about $1,500 per day to go to Sierra Tucson. I shouldn't say this live on the radio, but we can negotiate better deals if people are interested in that. So that's about 40,000 quid for 30 days. And sometimes people are horrified, and I say, well, it's the price of a car, an expensive car, but if it saves somebody lives and improves the quality of not just their lives, but the whole family. But I'm not in marketing, I'm not a salesman, so to be honest, I don't get involved in the costs. Some people can get this paid for on insurance. If you have an international insurance policy, that may be possible. It would need investigating. So how do people find the program? Well, you can contact me, or you can just look on the website, which is www.sierratucson.com. There's a UK number that you can ring for free. Mostly people will go for 30 days, but sometimes people go for 2 weeks. Sometimes people go for 6 weeks. I'm just reading through the questions. People can contact me directly. Is it okay to give out my email address online? It's okay. So my website is www.maxcohen.co.uk. And my email is max@maxcohen.co.uk. That's max@maxcohen.co.uk. And if people are, we didn't talk very much at the beginning about, if you're looking for a therapist, how do I find one? I'd be happy to chat to people and guide you if possible. Raj is asking, where is it in the USA? It's 10 miles north of Tucson, in the desert. Looks like John Wayne countryside with a saguaro cacti. Absolutely beautiful and peaceful. It's funny, I was reading a Marion Keyes novel today about one of the characters in the book has to take some time off. She works in New York in a fashion business, and everybody keeps saying, did you go to Arizona? And what they mean by that is, have you just been in treatment for your alcoholism? And she hadn't at all. So that phrase, have you been to Arizona? I don't know if it's a thing or not. I thought it was quite funny. Why do people get more upset by the cost of mental health treatment as opposed to physical operation? Well, that's a really interesting question, isn't it? I guess because it's invisible. If I need to have a hip replacement, you show me the X-ray, I can see what needs doing. You tell me, well, your brain isn't functioning so great. We think we might need to do some work with you, help you let go of this trauma. This is influencing your. I can't see it. I go into denial. Plus, we're not very good about talking about mental health in the UK. I think they're a bit more open in the States. I think there's more money in the States. There's more research, which is why they have these more sophisticated treatment programs. Thanks, Raj. It's been a real pleasure. It's been lovely to see you and talk to you. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.